Okay, so where should we start? Let's start with a story, in the beginning. Let's start right back in primordial times with the first yogi. And it's a great story from the Bhagavad Purana, Srimad Bhagavad Purana, which is probably, along with the Ramayana, I would say one of the two most influential texts in India. It's the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Purana, not the Yoga Sutras. Nobody's reading the Yoga Sutras in India. There's more people reading Yoga Sutras in the West than in India. The Yoga Sutras is a scholastic text and been imported into America because of various great swamis. And by the way, today is Thanksgiving, so seeing as how nobody really knows what the original Thanksgiving was all about, there seems to be several different stories. I think, we can give thanks to our teachers. It's been about 50 years now, since the 60s, that for some karmic reason, this window opens up in the 60s. Immigration restrictions are lifted in America, and a number of incredible beings came to the West. And just at that moment, social circumstances in the West were such that there was this hippie revolution, and people were experimenting and opening up their paradigms and very receptive to Eastern thought. And the combination of those two things resulted in a number of incredible teachers, one of whom was Swami Vishnudevananda, others too, coming to the West and planting seeds of yoga, different traditions, Adwaita Vedanta, Siddha Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Hatha Yoga, and so forth. And that's been about 50 years. So it's really encouraging to come to a place like an ashram like this and see that these seeds are thriving. These seeds have taken a life of their own. And hopefully will continue to do so. So we give thanks to our teachers, and we also give thanks to their disciples who've hung in there and are maintaining these places. It's not easy. It's not easy to maintain an ashram. By nature, maintenance is, even in the Indian tradition, Brahma is the creator. Maintenance it requires rajas, a certain amount of rajas. And yogis by nature are inclined to sattva. They're inclined to study, to japa. So to leave that calling almost to somehow negotiate with rajas in order to run, an ashram, especially a large ashram, and somehow not let that rajas get the better of you. Always keep the sattva controlling the rajas and not the other way around. You got to have rajas if you're going to maintain something. It's not going to happen just by sitting, chanting Om, or maybe it will, but it requires a certain amount of rajas. And so the trick then, of course, is to have that rajas under the control of sattva, and that's sometimes is not an easy thing to do, especially when the more one practices, the more one studies, the more one naturally is going to be drawn in the direction of meditation and study, and less drawn to management. So that's actually a sacrifice. So we should appreciate those who make that sacrifice and recognize that. So let's go back to primordial time. Vishnu, Narayana, lying in the causal ocean, Karnodaka side. This is the first yogi. We're going to start because we're going to talk about yoga, and what we're going to do together for the next 3 days is we're going to read the Yoga Sutras. Okay, so it's going to be a textual study. That's why I've been invited. So we're going to read the text together, verse by verse, sutra by sutra. We're going to unpack it, and we're going to really engage with the core of the Yoga Sutras. And then we're going to read another text together, which is a bhakti text, the Bhagavad Purana. I'm going to read verses from that. Very, very different world. You'll see, a very different world. One is all about closing out the world, stopping the mind, pratyahara, withdrawing senses, chitta vritti nirodha, stilling the mind, radical closing down of everything external and internal to gain an experience of pure consciousness. Drashtavusvarupe vasthanam. Consciousness abiding in its own nature. That's the project of the Yoga Sutras, which we're going to study, I believe, in the mornings. And then we're going to read this Bhagavata Purana, which is an entirely different thing, which is all about using the mind and the senses and absorbing the mind in these beautiful stories of Sri Krishna or incarnations of Ishvara. So, two very different things going on. Both have a certain common denominator. We're not this body, we're not these minds, we're pure consciousness. One is about consciousness absorbing itself in its own nature. The other is about consciousness absorbing itself in divine form, in love, in a loving relationship with divine presence. So it'll be interesting to see how those two texts, how they engage each other. And how you respond to them. But that's what we'll be doing for this workshop, okay? Tonight's just a quick introduction. And so let's go back to Vishnu, the first yogi. Vishnu is lying in the ocean. The causal, is called the Karana Dakasai, the Karana ocean. And from each pore of his body emanates universes. So there's unlimited universes. You can try to count how many pores there are on your body. That many universes, according to the Puranas. So then Vishnu, the primordial Vishnu, called the Mahavishnu, the Karanadakasai Vishnu, then manifests within each of these universes. So now there's unlimited universes within each. Vishnu, the Karana Vishnu, manifests as Ksirodakashai Vishnu, another form of Vishnu. So now each Vishnu, these are all parallel universes, each Vishnu now each universe has its own Vishnu. Also lying on an ocean. Within the universe is half filled with ocean according to Puranic notions this is a Puranic notion of creation. So Vishnu is lying there now, the secondary Vishnu, remember there's the secondary Vishnu. The secondary Vishnu, from the navel of that Vishnu emanates the lotus. This huge lotus, and you've all seen pictures of it, I'm sure. There's probably one, well, that's one of the Vishnus over there. And on top of this lotus, the first mortal being comes to consciousness. His name is Brahma, not to be confused with Brahman. Brahma, 4 heads. In our universe he has 4 heads. In other universes Brahma may have 100 heads or 1,000 heads because the universes are all different sizes. So this is the fun thing about Hinduism. They are such fun stories. Much more fun than reading the Yoga Sutras or the Vedanta Sutras. God forbid, that's even more dry. If anyone is engaged with it. And then of course if you read the Sutras you have to read the commentaries and that'll put you to sleep very quickly. But the stories, on the other hand, this is really how Hindus have received their yoga, from stories. The teachings are all there, but in these beautiful narratives. So the first created being, Swayambhu, self-manifest, doesn't have parents, okay? But he's a mortal being. Brahma is not on the same level as Vishnu or Shiva. Even though people talk about the so-called Trinity, that's a 19th century missionary projection, the Trinity. There's no Trinity. There's Vishnu and there's Shiva. These are transcendent beings. Brahma is not a transcendent being. He is, in fact, right in the Bhagavad Gita, his lifespan is given. Right in chapter, one of them, Act 8 perhaps. So Brahma is a secondary creator. He's the engineer. Okay, so he comes to be on the lotus. That's his birth. Right? Jati. He actually, Brahma is nothing other than the person with the highest karma. He's an Atman who was once a human like us, in this dimension, in this realm, but his karma was so incredibly super excellent that he gets the highest birth that is possible to get in samsara, and that highest birth is the birth of Brahma. There's only one Brahma, okay? And he has a dharma like everybody else. He has a job to perform, and his dharma is to create forms. He's a secondary creator. Why is he the secondary creator? Because he doesn't create the actual stuff, Prakriti. Prakriti is a manifestation of Narayana, Vishnu. But he takes that pre-existing stuff and he makes forms with it. Therefore, he's a secondary creator. Okay? So what's all this got to do with yoga? How is he the first yogi? So he comes to be on top of the lotus. Now it's pitch black. You can't see anything. Right? How would you even know you had eyes if you couldn't see anything? How would you know? If you just came to, if your consciousness just somehow manifests, right? Like after deep sleep, you wake up and all of a sudden you're conscious. So it was something like that. From a previous cycle, Brahma's consciousness is covered by tamas, right? His consciousness is eternal, can never not be. So it's covered by tamas, and at a certain point, he takes birth, he comes to be, Svayambhu, he self-manifests on the lotus, the tamas is removed, and now he's conscious. Okay, no memories. Just like when you're born, we don't have memories of our past life. So Brahma is born, he doesn't have any memories of where he came from. No mother to greet him. If you think about how we're born, right, in a hospital, and you come out and the doctors are there and everyone's cooing and oohing and you're swaddled and you're wrapped up and everybody's, so you're getting all this love, and even though it's so confusing, right, all of a sudden there's lights and there's space, right? You see babies that they wave their hands around because they've been so cooped up, so just the notion of space is pretty freaky. So the first thing you have to do is wrap them up so they don't freak out. And then you give them all this love, right? They scream, they cry, but eventually, very soon, remember my daughter was born, just from all that love, there's a sense of security and maybe familiarity with the voices, because you've heard the voices in the womb, you've heard the voices from outside, and then the mother takes the baby and nurses the baby, so there's the sense of the milk, right? And maybe there's some familiarity there. So all of that is a sense of familiarity. But imagine just coming to be on top of the lotus with none of that. How would you know you had senses if there were no sense objects? How would you know? How would you even understand what hearing was unless you heard something? You wouldn't even know you had an organ, an indriya of hearing. So he comes to be pitch blackness, so nothing to see, and therefore no notion that you even have sight. No sound, and therefore no notion that you even have a faculty of hearing. No smell, so no notion that you have these senses at all. The only sense of which he was aware was touch. And he felt, and he could feel that he was sitting on something. Okay? No real sense of things. So somehow or other he had, maybe from his past life, some samskaras activated just enough to give him an awareness that he's sitting on something, and you could feel. So there was a sensation. So he goes to the edge of the lotus and realizes it's got an edge, and then he realizes it's got a stem. So he starts climbing down, and he climbs and he climbs and he climbs and he climbs, but he doesn't get to the bottom. He doesn't see Vishnu. And you can't just see Vishnu anyway. You have to have Dibya Dadami Te Chakshus, as Krishna says to Arjuna in the Gita. I will give you divine eyes. You can see these divine forms. You can't see divine forms with Prakritic eyes. So Brahma climbs and climbs, nothing going on. You know, maybe the lotus is like wobbling a bit, I don't know. But he climbs back up, and he realizes that he has no idea of who he is, where he is, from no notions of space, no notions of time, right? How would you have notions of space and time? Unless there's space means you have to see, right? This is different from that. There's a pillar over here, there's a pillar over there. There's something in between. We call that space. So how would you even have a notion of space if you couldn't see things? How would you have a notion of time if you couldn't see movement? Time is nothing other than movement. You have to see something move, and you say, well, it's a day, because the sun has moved. Or it's a year, because the earth has revolved, or whatever. So without sight, you have no notion of space or time. So there he is, and completely confused, completely bewildered, completely alone. I mean, imagine talking about existential dilemma. I mean, just imagine this, right? At least we have our little existential dilemmas. We can, climb into bed and get depressed or something, or read a book. But he can't do any of that. So there he is, and somehow or other, I think there's two versions of the story. And in one version of the story, he hears this word. He hears the sound. Ba, ba. And presumably, why would he even know what that meant? Ba, ba. But presumably then, the samskara, clearly, Brahma's been around forever, previous births. So somehow or other in his chitta, the memory of the meaning of that word somehow manifest, and he understood what that word meant, and he understood that he had to engage in austerity. And what austerity was he going to engage in? And he realized that the mind that was so confused was not going to help him. The mind was simply creating confusion. That mind that was churning away, vrittying away. We're going to encounter this word, chitta vritti. Can you imagine your chitta vritti coming to be on the top of a lotus with absolutely no contact with anything? So he realized enough. He realized that this mind was not going to figure out who he was, where he was, or what he was supposed to do. So he heard the word tapa and understood that he had to still the mind. He had to go beyond the mind in order to get some understanding. The mind itself was not going to provide him any insight into who he was, or what reality was, or what anything was. So he entered into a state of chitta vritti nirodha, which is the definition of yoga. So he was the first yogi. So he stills the mind, and he enters into a state of samadhi, and then Vishnu reveals himself to Brahma. He has a vision of Vishnu, and Vishnu then says, okay, this is who you are, and this is your role, and now I want you to create forms of the universe, and then forms get created, and that's the Puranic story of creation. So Brahma is the first yogi, and he's called Hiranyagarbha, and the yoga tradition, the pre-modern Indian yoga tradition, when they think about who is the originator of yoga, they identify Hiranyagarbha. And there supposedly was a text called the Hiranyagarbha Samhita, which has been lost, but which Patanjali then re-represents. And the Yoga Sutras that we're going to study tomorrow is really the same 60 topics that were in Hiranyagarbha's text. Those same 60 topics we would find in the Yoga Sutras. So therefore we can accept that it is a continuation of those original teachings. So that's the story of yoga, the origins of yoga. Coming down to terms of literary history, we have a genre of texts called the Upanishads. Who's heard of the Upanishads? Some of you have read the Upanishads. And it's in these texts that we find the first references to something called yoga. Very brief references in the Chandogya, in the Katha Upanishads. Mostly the Upanishads are texts that speak about the absolute truth as Brahman. That there is this ultimate truth that is Brahman. And that this body and this mind and the ephemeral world are temporary truths. And we've all heard this so many times, of course. And so the Upanishads are Jnana Yoga texts. They're texts that tell us about who we really are, that we're actually Atman, and that the goal of life is to seek the higher self. We've all heard this. But they don't really give us so much technique. Upanishads don't give us too much technique about how do you go about realizing this. Okay, so you study the Upanishads, that's one way, Jnana Yoga, you fill the mind with samskaras, okay, you read, you study. all of those samskaras go in the chitta, the mind starts to become transformed. Okay, this is Jnana Yoga. This is the path of Jnana Yoga, the path of intense study and changing what goes into the mind, filling it with Upanishadic wisdom sayings. And the mind, of course, is a lens. The mind is how we see the world. Consciousness sees the world through the mind. So according to the state of the mind, we see the world. So if the mind is completely saturated in Upanishadic study and Upanishadic wisdom, consciousness flowing through that mind begins to see the world in an Upanishadic fashion. Begin to see the world as the Upanishads describe it, as temporary, as ever-changing, as unfulfilling, and all. This is Jnana Yoga. Jnana Yoga is nothing other than saturating the mind with intense, shravanam, hearing, studying of these sacred texts. So that's one way. But elsewhere in the Upanishads, here and there, and that's the Vedanta way, by the way. The Vedantic path tends to be one of intense study and absorbing the mind in scripture. And maybe if we have time, we'll say a little bit about these different paths. So maybe tonight we'll just give a little bit of context. So, a little bit of background. And then tomorrow we'll start our textual study. So here and there in the Upanishads, in the Katha and the Chandogya Upanishads, you get this reference to a technique for realizing Atman, called yoga. Just a few references. In the Shvetashvatara it says a yogi has to sit by a running river, which I always used to wonder about. I was like, why a running river? I thought maybe the sound is peaceful and sattvic. And one time I was up in the Alps somewhere, and I was meditating, and there were flies everywhere. I was sitting in a fly. And I sat on this rock in the river, a big rock right in the middle of the river, no flies. And I suddenly thought, maybe that's what it means. That why running river? Because it keeps the flies off. That was my little realization. Anyway, so the Shvetashvatara says the yogi, he's quite graphic. He says he doesn't pee very much, doesn't poop very much. Well, what does that mean? Why is it telling us about the yogi's, defecation habits? Well, because that means he doesn't eat very much. How else do you not poo very much? You don't eat very much. That's what it's saying. So the yogi is someone that's very minimalistic in eating. And if you read these the old texts, they're quite radical. These people are very radical. They're living on berries and fruits in the forest. Some of them just living on dried leaves. This is radical asceticism. We have so lost touch with this. It is so not a part of our modern consumer lifestyle. The Upanishads then are these forest books. They are Aranyakas. They're situated in the forest. Why the forest? Because if you are seeking truth, if you come to the conclusion that truth isn't out there, because out there is changing, everything is changing, and you decided to seek truth within, so you don't want to be distracted, so where do you go? Well, you don't sit in the middle of the Jersey Turnpike, you go to the forest. So the Upanishads then, in the Upanishads we get our first references to this thing called yoga. And it involves dhyana. The term is dhyana that's used in the old text. Dhyana, the stilling of the mind on an object. But we don't really get very much information. So from the Upanishadic period, then, eventually, the sense arises that we need to have a more systematic analysis, a more systematic presentation, not just of yoga, but of other fields, hermeneutics, and so forth. And so from the Upanishadic period, you have what we now call the 6 schools of Indian philosophy emerge. Of course, back then there probably weren't 6. Some texts talk about 13, some talk about 8, etc., etc. One of those schools is the Yoga Sutras. of Patanjali. It becomes a school later on. So there's a sense that, two things actually. There's two types of, you get a sense of two things going on. Prior to the sutra traditions. The first is the sense that the age of Kali is that people can't remember anymore. But we think of writing as a sign of progress, right? When we think of progress of human civilization, we think of the wheel, we think of fire, and we think of writing as big sort of milestones forward in sort of human progress. Well, not so the ancient Indians. For them, the invention of writing was a sign of deterioration, that people could no longer remember things. And therefore they had to invent a crutch. It's like my dad. My dad, he prides himself, he can add things up. He disdains calculators. For him, the fact that if I sit there with a calculator, he'll stick his nose up in the air, and for him, that's a sign of decline of intellectuality, that you have to use a machine to add up sums. Well, there is a sense then that at the end of the Kali Yuga, the end of the Dwapara Yuga, the previous age, there's a sense that the age, negative influences are occurring karmically. The age has changed. People's abilities are declining, and people's intellectual abilities are declining, and therefore the sacred knowledge systems are in danger of being lost. And so then you have the emergence of sutra traditions. And a sutra is a style of writing, and it's a style of preserving technical information, where you compact the maximum amount of information in the minimal amount of words. So an expert sutra writer is somebody who doesn't waste a single phoneme. There's even a saying that the sutrakara, the writer of a sutra, takes more pleasure if he saves one phoneme than if he has a child. More pleasure in saving a phoneme. So sutras are very, very mode of writing. They're a way of preserving technical information, so it gets preserved. So that's one of the things that there's a sense that therefore there's a need to preserve these what had previously been oral traditions. There is a need to preserve them. So one of these traditions that emerges is the Yoga Sutras. That up until this time, yoga was simply being taught from master to disciple in the forests, under the trees, and there was no systematic kind of text that kind of the authoritative text that one could turn to, authoritative kind of standardized, systematized exposition of yoga that didn't exist. It was just in the hands of individual gurus teaching their disciples. And you see it all through before the Yoga Sutras. You see it all in the Mahabharata, in the old parts of the Mahabharata. You see it in the Upanishads. You see it in the old Puranas. Whenever yoga is referred to, whenever yogi is referred to, it's in the forest. It's a hermitage. It's one charismatic individual, maybe with a couple of disciples, and that's it. That's the context. No ashrams, no monasteries, nothing like that. So, therefore, a need, Patanjali, a need was felt to somehow preserve this thing called yoga and systematize it. Otherwise, it was going to become corrupt because of the influences of the age. All right, so you have the Yoga Sutras, and you have other sutra traditions. You have the Vedanta Sutras. Vedanta Sutras is the same problem, different problem. The problem the Vedanta tradition has to tackle is this. The Upanishads are heterogeneous texts. They say one thing here and something over there. Over here, they speak of Brahman as a personal being. Over there, they speak of Atman and Brahman as one. Over here, Atman and Brahman are different. Over here, the world is real. Over here, the world is false. How do you make sense? How do you make sense of this? How do you make sense of these Upanishads that appear to be saying conflicting things? one thing you cannot say if you're a traditional Hindu, what would a scholar say? A scholar would say, what? Different people wrote the texts, right? The texts are written over 200, 300, 400 years, so therefore different people are writing them, and naturally are saying different things at different times. Now, why can't you say that if you're a traditional Hindu? Why is that option off the table? They're Apaurushaya. They're Apaurushaya. They have no author. They're divine texts. They're eternal texts. They're not written by humans. That's what Apaurushaya means. They are Shruti, to be different things written in different Upanishads because different people wrote them. That's not an option. So what do you have to say? You have to say, well, and the other thing you can't say is if these texts are divine, you can't say they're imperfect. You can't say, well, different things are written in different places because the author was confused. That's not an option. Alright? So therefore, you have to say, no, actually the texts are consistent, they are coherent, you just need a lens. You need to have a lens, a siddhanta. This is the term siddhanta in Sanskrit. You need to have a siddhanta through which to read the texts. And if you apply this siddhanta, then all of a sudden the texts fall into place, they make sense, and you'll see that there is no disagreement or discrepancy. Okay, and I'll give you, well, in your lineage, the lineage of Adwaita, I'll give you an example of one of these siddhantas. In the Adwaita Vedanta lineage, the siddhanta is this. There's two levels of reality. Paramarthika, there's the Paramarthika and the Vyavaharika. There's the highest level, ultimate reality, and then there's conventional reality. So when the text, so this is a lens. So then you can apply this to Upanishad and say, oh, well, when the texts are talking about the world as being real, and when the texts are talking about creation and Narayana and Vishnu as being a creator, and when the texts are talking about the Atman being an individual, well, they're referring to it from the Vyavaharika, the conventional point of view. But in these other passages where the text is talking about Brahman, Satyam, Jagat Mithya, Tattvamasi, Neti Neti, the great Mahavakyas of Shankara, in these other places where the text is talking as if the world is not real, as if Atman and Brahman are one, they're not different. In these other places, then the text is talking from a Paramarthika perspective. So this is a lens. This is a hermeneutic. Hermeneutics is how do we interpret scripture. It's a hermeneutical lens. So the Vedanta tradition then, its project is different from the Yoga tradition. The Vedanta tradition's project is how do we get consistent meaning from the Upanishads? And the only problem is, there's a problem. The Yoga tradition doesn't have this problem. The Yoga Sutra tradition has the Yoga Sutras, and then it has the commentary of Vyasa, and it has various commentaries over the years. All of the commentaries are consistent with each other. They all agree with each other. They all build on each other. They don't disagree. There's no debate within the Yoga Sutra tradition. But that's not the case with the Vedanta Sutra tradition. In the Vedanta Sutra tradition you have Adwaita Vedanta, and you have Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, and you have Dvaita Vedanta, and you have Achintya Bheda Vedanta, and you have a number of different schools who do disagree. Alright, enough of all that. So from the Upanishads then you have the Vedanta tradition emerges, many sub-branches, and their main task is to try, one of the main projects of the Vedanta tradition then is to interpret the Upanishads, and Badarayana writes the Vedanta Sutra. The Vedanta Sutras is essentially a text that's interpreting the Upanishads. Practically every single verse of the Vedanta Sutras is a verse from the Upanishads. At the same time, you have a whole different type of thing going on, which is called the Puranas. You have 18 Puranas, which is really what Hinduism is. Hinduism is the stories of divine incarnation, divine manifestation. So the Puranas are a genre of texts within which, this is where we find all the great stories of Ganesh and Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna. Where do you get that? You don't get any of that stuff in the Upanishads. Okay, maybe the Shvetashvatara, we have a little reference to Shiva, to Rudra. But it's really the Puranas then that are popular Hinduism, on the ground Hinduism, the Hinduism that people practice in the real world, is coming from the Puranas. And in the Puranas, 18 Puranas and 2 other texts as well, called Itihasa, histories, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And these texts then focus on divine incarnations, divine beings. Vishnu, Shiva, Vishnu's incarnations of Rama and Krishna, goddess, various goddess, manifestations of the goddess forms, and what these Puranica traditions then are encouraging is a type of yoga which you've all heard of called Bhakti Yoga. And Bhakti Yoga then essentially means, in Hinduism, Bhakti Yoga means developing a heart relationship with one of these divine beings, and practicing a form of yoga where the mind is utilized, the senses are utilized, the mind is absorbed, and begins to develop attachment. Okay, begins to develop an attachment for this divine being. It's very different from the attachments that we're supposed to give up in yoga, the ragas and dveshas of yoga, which are attachments pertaining to the body-mind, to the false I. And we'll talk about this. Of course, we'll read the Yoga Sutras, and all of this will be, Patanjali will carefully unravel this whole, what is the false I, what is ignorance. It'll give us all these, one of the best places to get definitions for these things. What is ignorance? What is avidya? What is asmita? What is a raga? What is a dvesha? The Yoga Sutras is one of the best places to get these definitions. Better than the Gita in some ways. You don't get them so much in the Upanishads or the Vedanta Sutra. You don't get a definition of these terms in quite the clear, concise way that we get them in the Yoga Sutras. So we'll be looking at that tomorrow. But for now, I just wanted to say that this other genre of texts, then, the Puranas, is where we find a different type of yoga, which is not based on the study of the Vedanta. It's not based on Chitta-vritti Nirodha, stilling the mind, or the other schools of the other 6 schools. One of them is logic, one of them is metaphysics, one of them is Mimamsa, which is about Vedic ritualism, technical information pertaining to how to do a Vedic rite, a yajna. So these are technical fields, again, for scholastics, for the Brahmana caste. Very hard. You have to know Sanskrit to engage them. You have to spend many years of studying, and so on and so forth. Because now everything is translated, easily available. But to really understand those texts takes a lot of training. So, but really, Hinduism is these Puranas. The Puranas are the texts where we find these stories of Vishnu, of the goddess, of Krishna, of Ganesh, these incredible stories like the one I spoke about, Brahma, on the lotus. These stories are all coming from the Puranas, and they're very captivating, and they charm the mind. And the idea of bhakti then is that rather than stilling the mind becomes absorbed in thinking about these stories. That's what Bhakti Yoga is. Bhakti Yoga is a love affair. It's about falling in love with a form of Ishvara. It's about hearing the stories, or chanting them. That's what kirtan is. What is kirtan? When we do kirtan, what is it? What do the words mean? When we chant these songs, Raghupati Raghava Raja Ram, what is that? These are little snippets, these are little incidents coming from the Ramayana, and nothing other than that. Right? Jai Govinda, Jai Gopal, what is that? That's Krishna who is herding the cows. It's not a symbol, it's not a metaphor. These are what you might want to say they're symbols of metaphor in the 21st century West, because we don't know what to do with them. But what they are traditionally, these are representations, these are ways of absorbing the mind in these stories. And why would one want to do that? Because when the mind is absorbed in these beautiful stories, one transcends desire, one does all the things one is supposed to do in yoga, one transcends asmita, ego, one breaks this illusory identification with the body-mind, becomes absorbed in this very attractive form of Ishvara. And the traditions, the Puranika traditions say, Ishvara then bestows liberation. This is grace. Bhakti is about grace. We still have to do the work, but then the divine being plucks us out of ignorance. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be reading one of the stories, my favorite story, one of my favorite stories from the Bhagavata Purana, the 10th book, which is when Krishna is out in the forest with the cows. And so we'll be doing that. So this is then the textual landscape of India. You have part of it anyway. Of course, it's vast. But in terms of some of the principal texts relevant to the practice of yoga, you have the Upanishads. Actually, you have older texts before the Upanishads called the Vedas. But they're a whole different universe. They're a whole different thing altogether. Vedas are a completely different. They're a completely different genre of texts that have to do with ritualism, that have to do with pouring things into sacred fire in order to be transported to celestial beings, in order to get stuff. The Vedas are, the Upanishads criticize Vedic ritualism. The Gita, right in the 2nd chapter, Krishna criticizes Yamimam Pushpitam Vacham, the Vedic ritualists. So we're not even going to talk about the Vedas. So in terms of the texts that interest us, in terms of the texts that some of which have come over, been transplanted to the West, we have the Upanishads. From the Upanishads we have the 6 schools, the Sutra traditions, or at least 6 of them, and then Yoga Sutras and Vedanta Sutras are probably the 2 that you've heard of. The Yoga Sutras is what we'll be studying. Vedanta Sutras is essentially trying to understand the Upanishads in a coherent, systematic way by applying a Siddhanta, a lens, to make sense of them. Then we have these Puranas, these 18 Puranas, which really haven't been transplanted so much to the West. We don't know what to do with all these. We think of them as mythology. What do we do with Rama, Krishna, right? We think of them in the same way as we think of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We think, oh, it's Indo-European, we left that behind 2,000 years ago, it's myth. So when we read these stories, the only samskaras we have to make sense of them are the samskaras that we've applied to our Greco-Roman traditions. And so we relegate them to the category of myth, because that's what we've been told to do. We've been told that these things are myths that nobody believes in anymore. We've left them behind 1,500, 2,000 years ago, and now we just read them as archaic literature. We read the Iliad and the Odyssey as just intellectual, kind of, because it's a world classic. Nobody worships Zeus anymore, right? So these are traditions that we have left behind. So what do we do when we encounter from the Indian side of the Indo-European family? Remember, this is a related family, Indo-European. So the Greeks and Romans are on one side of this family. The Indian stuff is the eastern side. What do we do when we hear these stories? we think they're myths. And so then we say, well, how do we, well, okay, but we have a problem, because it's still a living tradition, and so we say, okay, how do we make sense of it? It's not like the Greeks, it's been, Greek religion's been dead 1,500 years, but this is still a living tradition, a billion people following this, so how are we going to make sense of it? So we start talking about metaphors and symbols. We start saying these stories are symbolic or metaphoric, because these are the only categories that we have that we project onto them. But the traditions themselves are not saying they're myths. The stories themselves, there's nowhere in the Puranas that says, oh, this is a myth. This is a metaphor for some higher truth. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say, oh, Krishna is symbolic for something else. These stories present themselves as being actual divine manifestations. That they are, that God has the ability to manifest incredible, beautiful, unlimited forms, some of which can enter into the world, some of which do enter into the world, and that's what incarnation is. That's what Krishna says in the Gita, yada yada hi dharmasya. We all know the verses. Whenever there is a decline in dharma, I incarnate. Sambhavami yuge yuge. I come every age. So these incarnations, these manifestations, some of them are fabulous. Why not? Why can't you, if you're God, why not manifest fabulous forms? Why not have 4 arms? Why not have 16 arms? Why not? Who's going to say you can't do that? If you're God, right? What do you say? No, sorry, I've only got 2 arms. You can only have 2 arms. Right? So God can have as many arms as He wants to have. And you can manifest as many. This is Hindu theism. This is what Hindu monotheism is. These beautiful, unlimited, eternal forms that are not prakritic. They're not made of Prakriti stuff. They're Brahman forms. So the Puranas then are the texts that describe this whole aspect of Hinduism, this aspect of divine presence, divine forms, and promotes a type of yoga called Bhakti Yoga, which consists of the developing a relationship, a devotional relationship with one of these forms through mantras and pujas and various things which we can talk about when we get to that part of our workshop. So I had no idea what to say tonight, so I just thought I'd throw some stuff at you, and that's what we'll be doing. We'll be reading Yoga Sutras, we'll be reading Bhagavad Purana. If anybody has any questions, I think we finish at 9. Oh, we finish at 9:45. Do you have any questions or comments on that? Yes?
Yeah, so we basically talked about the historic roots of Bhakti Yoga and Jnana Yoga. What about Raja Yoga?
Well, Raja Yoga is a term that's not used it's used in the Bhagavad Gita, and it's used to refer to classic Patanjali yoga. So the roots of that are so that's, when we talk about Raja Yoga, that's Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, but that isn't the first text, so that's why we had that whole story about Hiranyagarbha. That would be considered to be Raja Yoga. And if we don't want to go with the stories and we want to just look at the text, then the roots of Raja Yoga are in the Upanishads. In the Upanishads, in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, in the Katha Upanishad, we have our first, in terms of actual literature, references to this thing called, it's not called Raja Yoga, it's called Dhyana Yoga. Raja Yoga is just what the Gita calls it. Raja Yoga is not a common, you don't find that term elsewhere. That type of yoga in all the other texts is not called Raja Yoga, it's called Dhyana. Okay, it's not called Ashtanga. Even Patanjali doesn't call it Ashtanga, he just says it is yoga which has Ashtanga, which has 8 limbs. So when Raja Yoga meaning Chitta Vritti Nirodha Yoga, stilling the mind yoga, yes? That's what you're referring to?
Well, the scientific approach to enlightenment is basically to a methodology that you apply in any way, and then you reach enlightenment. Whereas Jnana Yoga, you apply knowledge, or Bhakti Yoga, you apply devotion, right? And Raja Yoga, but as my understanding is basically you apply physical exercise, meditation, basically some kind of technique to reach the same goal.
Right. So the origins, and you want to know what the origins of that are?
That's right.
The Upanishads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's now a little bit of, I was actually more referring, there is a debate, especially, so we're going into the Ashtanga world and we're going into physical yoga, asanas, for instance. There are some people suggesting there's very little in the ancient texts mentioning about this, and I was just wondering if you had any deeper knowledge about what is real.
Well, there's a couple of books out now. One by Mark Singleton called, which are worth reading, which basically demonstrate, I think, that much of what we do in asana goes back to the 19th century. It doesn't go beyond that. A lot of it has to do with British gymnastics, etc., etc. The Krishnamacharya tradition. Asana. It's called Modern Postural. Mark Singleton, I think it's called Yoga Body. Excellent. Excellent. Very worth reading. In terms of the textual tradition, okay, we have the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which has 3 verses on asana. Okay, let's call it asana so that we're clear about what we're referring to. The postural yoga, if you want to use a more precise term, we should call it postural yoga. That postural yoga, we find 3 verses in Patanjali, right? Stiram sukham asanam, tatadvanvo na vigataha, 3 verses. Which don't say anything about poses. They just say asana is that. Asana, by the way, meaning a seat. That's what asana actually technically means. It's what allows you to sit. So stiram sukham, asana is that which allows you to sit stiram, solidly, and sukham, comfortably. Now, in the first commentary on the Yoga Sutras by Vyas, written around the 3rd or the 4th century, Vyas lists 11 poses. It's the earliest list we have. Vyas, in his commentary to the Yoga Sutras, lists 11 poses. I think 5 or 6 of them have the same names that we still use today. There are 3 or 4 that we don't use those names, we're not sure, but they're described by the different commentaries. So we have that. Other than that, the Mahabharata mentions 2 or 3 asanas. The great Mahabharata, 100,000 verses, biggest epic in the world, mentions 2 or 3 poses. Apart from that, we have the much later, we have the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which nobody has ever heard of in India. That Hatha Yoga Pradipika is plucked out of obscurity precisely because it's the only text that you can sort of find where it has only 1 out of 4 chapters is on asana. And therefore it was then plucked out of obscurity and then sort of bandied around as an authoritative source. That's where we get the term Hatha from. So that has, I think, 33. I think that, I'm not sure. I think it mentions 33 poses, but it's 17th century. Then there's a couple of other texts that go on the Samhita and a few of these other late texts. So that doesn't mean people weren't doing asanas. It just means we don't have a literary tradition. We don't have a sutra. We have a Yoga Sutra, Vedanta Sutra, Sankhya Sutra. We do not have an Asana Sutra. So we never had a tradition that preserved anything. Okay, so all we know is in the 3rd century, Vyas mentions 11, and then he says etc. Which means there were more. Right? If you have a list of 11 and then you finish the list and say etc., that means there were probably a lot more. We don't have any literary record of that. So much of what we are doing today as yoga was put together by 2 great teachers of the 20th century, Krishnamacharya and actually Sivananda. And they put together, and a lot of, there's a certain amount of, Krishnamacharya's tradition has been heavily scrutinized in terms of what were his sources, and a lot of that comes from British gymnastics, not from Vedic texts. It comes from British gymnastics. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's asanas still do what they're supposed to do what Vyas wants them to do, which is train up. What does it matter? The goal is the same. And that is, the asanas are ways of training the body so that one can sit and still the mind. And that's classical yoga. That's Raja Yoga. Okay? Raja Yoga is a term that's only used in the Gita. It's not the usual term. If you really want to refer to that type of yoga, in the old text it's called dhyana. Dhyana is the seventh limb of Patanjali's yoga, but actually that's the term that's used, dhyana. So you've got bhakti yoga, you've got karma yoga. By the way, even karma yoga, actually the term in the Gita, the term that's used mostly for that is buddhi yoga. Buddhi yoga. Anyway, we have bhakti yoga, karma yoga, we have jnana yoga, and you have this Raja yoga. There are so many yogas. Who said there's 4 yogas? Vivekananda said there were 4 yogas. Oh, it was Vivekananda said that. There's so many yogas. What about Tantra? There's so many yogas. Any other question? We have pre-Patanjali. We have a lot of information about yoga in a pre-Patanjalian source. The Upanishads don't say very much. So there we have some references to pranayama, but no detailed information. You don't have a text saying, breathe in for 4, hold for 16, breathe out for 8. All of that is new, is modern. We don't have any ancient texts that say this is how pranayama should be done. We have references here and there. Vyas says, okay, back then when they did pranayama, they would do this. Instead of counting 1, om, and 1, om, 2, om, 3, like we do, for example, here, they had 2 ways of doing it. One was just going, and another was doing this. So we have these little references here and there, but we don't have any specific details in terms of pranayama. We do know that yoga involved some form of, one was that it was a seated thing. We know this from the old text. That it involved dhyana, that it involved concentrating the mind, and that it involved pranayama exercises. We just don't have the details of what those exercises were. They were handed down from teacher to disciple. So therefore, whatever we read, you get a book on pranayama, it's modern. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's invalid. I'm just saying we don't have an ancient Vedic, literary, scriptural tradition giving us any techniques of pranayama. We do, however, know that that yoga involved pranayama. There's no question about that. That when yoga was practiced in the ancient days, it involved breath control, and it involved fixing the mind. We know that. So then Patanjali comes along and he writes the Yoga Sutras, and what does he say about pranayama? He says, bhaya bhyantara, Dirgha Sukshma, pranayama. He gives a couple of verses. He says, pranayama means, gati vichetaha. You interrupt the breathing, and how do you interrupt it? You interrupt it by breathing in. You interrupt it by breathing out, and you hold, and you make it sukshma and dirgha. You make it long and subtle. So he gives us basics, but he doesn't say, okay, count 15 or count. That kind of information, would have been part of the oral tradition. As it still is. So Sivananda has his tradition, and Krishnamacharya has his tradition. And remember, in Hinduism, you don't have a pope who gets up on the pulpit and the Vatican, and then says, okay, this is pranayama for all Christendom. And it shall be forevermore. You don't have a central authoritative figure that's going to give definitions of what is pranayama, what is asana, and how do you hold it, and do you count to 4, do you count to 8, do you count to 20? You don't have. Hinduism doesn't have this central, clergy or a council or a pope figure or anything like that, and so therefore, who decides these things? The charismatic, the gurus do. But the guru sitting under this tree is going to have different from the guru sitting under that tree. So therefore you're going to have all of these variants. And that's Hinduism. There is, Hinduism is every village has its own unique little bhakti thing going on. It's got its little puja, it's got its little story about this or that. It's very hard to find. At a certain point then, people, at a certain point, the sutras get written, the Yoga Sutras, the Vedanta Sutras, and then these become sort of classical texts that people sort of accept. But to return to your question, pranayama is one of those things that we don't have a literary tradition. I think we're done.
Thank you.
Okay. And the combination of those two things resulted in a number of incredible teachers, one of whom was Swami Vishnudevananda, others too, coming to the West and planting seeds of yoga, different traditions, Adwaita Vedanta, Siddha Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Hatha Yoga, and so forth. And that's been about 50 years. So it's really encouraging to come to a place like an ashram like this and see that these seeds are thriving. These seeds have taken a life of their own. And hopefully will continue to do so. So we give thanks to our teachers, and we also give thanks to those, their disciples, who've hung in there and are maintaining these places. It's not easy. It's not easy to maintain an ashram. By nature, maintenance is, even in the Indian tradition, Brahma is the creator. Maintenance it requires rajas, a certain amount of rajas. And yogis by nature are inclined to sattva, they're inclined to study, to japa. So to leave that calling almost, to somehow negotiate with rajas in order to run, an ashram, especially a large ashram, and somehow not let that rajas get the better of you. Always keep the sattva controlling the rajas and not the other way around. You got to have rajas if you're going to maintain something. It's not going to happen just by sitting, chanting Om, or maybe will, but it requires a certain amount of rajas. And so the trick then, of course, is to have that rajas under the control of sattva, and that's sometimes is not an easy thing to do, especially when the more one practices, the more one studies, the more one naturally is going to be drawn in the direction of meditation and study, and less drawn to management. So that's actually a sacrifice. So we should appreciate those who make that sacrifice and recognize that. So let's go back to primordial time. Vishnu, Narayana, lying in the causal ocean, Karnodaka side. This is the first yogi. We're going to start because we're going to talk about yoga, and what we're going to do together for the next 3 days is we're going to read the Yoga Sutras. Okay, so it's going to be a textual study. That's why I've been invited. So we're going to read the text together, verse by verse, sutra by sutra. We're going to unpack it, and we're going to really engage with the core of the Yoga Sutras. And then we're going to read another text together, which is a bhakti text, the Bhagavata Purana. I'm going to read verses from that. Very, very different world. You'll see, a very different world. One is all about closing out the world, stopping the mind, pratyahara, withdrawing senses, chitta vritti nirodha, stilling the mind, a radical closing down of everything external and internal to gain an experience of pure consciousness, drashtavusurupe vasthanam, consciousness abiding in its own nature. That's the project of the Yoga Sutras, which we're going to study, I believe, in the mornings. And then we're going to read this Bhagavata Purana, which is an entirely different thing, which is all about using the mind and the senses and absorbing the mind in these beautiful stories. This is a Puranic notion of creation. So So Vishnu is lying there now, the secondary Vishnu, remember there's the secondary Vishnu. The secondary Vishnu, from the navel of that Vishnu emanates a lotus. This huge lotus, and you've all seen pictures of it, I'm sure. There's probably one. Well, that's one of the Vishnus over there. And on top of this lotus, the first mortal being comes to consciousness. His name is Brahma, not to be confused with Brahman. Brahma, 4 heads. In our universe, he has 4 heads. In other universes, Brahma may have 100 heads or 1,000 heads, because the universes are all different sizes. So this is the fun thing about Hinduism. They are such fun stories. Much more fun than reading the Yoga Sutras or the Vedanta Sutras. God forbid, that's even more dry. If anyone is engaged with it. And then, of course, if you read the sutras, you have to read the commentaries, and that'll put you to sleep very quickly. But the stories, on the other hand, this is really how Hindus have received their yoga, from stories. The teachings are all there, but in these beautiful narratives. So the first created being, Swayambhu, self-manifest, doesn't have parents, okay? But he's a mortal being. Brahma is not on the same level as Vishnu or Shiva. Even though people talk about the so-called Trinity, that's a 19th century missionary projection, the Trinity. There's no Trinity. There's Vishnu and there's Shiva. These are transcendent beings. Brahma is not a transcendent being. He is, in fact, right in the Bhagavad Gita, his lifespan is given. Right? Okay, so where should we start? Let's start with a story, in the beginning. Let's start right back in primordial times with the first yogi. And it's a great story from the Bhagavad Purana, Srimad Bhagavad Purana, which is probably, along with the Ramayana, I would say one of the 2 most influential texts in India. It's the Ramayana and the Bhagavad Purana, not the Yoga Sutras. Nobody's reading the Yoga Sutras in India. There's more people reading Yoga Sutras in the West than in India. The Yoga Sutras is a scholastic text, and been imported into America because of various great swamis. And by the way, today is Thanksgiving, so seeing as how nobody really knows what the original Thanksgiving was all about, there seems to be several different stories. I think, we can give thanks to our teachers. It's been about 50 years now, since the 60s, that for some karmic reason, this window opens up in the 60s. Immigration restrictions are lifted in America, and a number of incredible beings came to the West. And just at that moment, social circumstances in the West were such that there was this hippie revolution, and people were experimenting and opening up their paradigms, and very receptive to Eastern thought of Sri Krishna or incarnations of Ishvara. So 2 very different things going on. Both have a certain common denominator. We're not this body, we're not these minds, we're pure consciousness. One is about consciousness absorbing itself in its own nature. The other is about consciousness absorbing itself in divine form, in love, in a loving relationship with divine presence. So it'll be interesting to see how those 2 texts, how they engage each other, and how you respond to them. But that's what we'll be doing for this workshop. Okay, tonight's just a quick introduction. And so let's go back to Vishnu, the first yogi. Vishnu is lying in the ocean. The causal is called the Karana Dakasai, the Karana ocean, and from each pore of his body emanates universes. So there's unlimited universes. You can try to count how many pores there are on your body. That many universes, according to the Puranas. So then Vishnu, the primordial Vishnu, called the Mahavishnu, the Karanadakasai Vishnu, then manifests within each of these universes. So now there's unlimited universes within each. Vishnu, the Karana Vishnu, manifests as Ksirodakashai Vishnu, another form of Vishnu. So now each Vishnu, these are all parallel universes, each Vishnu now each universe has its own Vishnu. Also lying on an ocean. Within the universe is half filled with ocean according to Puranic notions